Joe Lindsley is a traveler and a writer and an American reporting on Chicago's WGN radio from Ukraine each and every weekday of Russia's full-scale war. And of course, we are approaching the third year of that. This is a marathon, not a sprint. He was once protégé to Fox News founder Roger Ailes, but Lindsley escaped that frenzied world where power mattered more than truth. He came to Ukraine and discovered something worth defending. And I think this is important. And I think Joe's connection with Fox News is important because, of course, today we're going to talk quite extensively about the forthcoming election and what the impact of that could be for Ukraine's future and any concept of victory. Welcome to Silicon Curtain. Please, if you get to the end of this material and you appreciate what we're doing, then definitely make sure you like, check you are subscribed so you don't miss any of the new material coming up, our fantastic speakers that appear daily. Please also do check out our fundraiser for the film that we're hoping to make to counter Russian propaganda like the Russians at War film, which continues to be shown and planned to be shown at film festivals. Ukraine needs to have a voice. Ukraine needs to have a response to these weaponized lies. Joe, welcome to the channel.
Jonathan, great to see you. I know we had a routine of speaking every month, but it's been, I think, since June. I didn't talk to you really throughout the summer, and I can talk a bit about my adventures during that time. I spent a lot of it in Kyiv and in Odessa. In Odessa, it was pretty harrowing pretty often, came under missile fire, including one time when I was out in a park running, nowhere to go, a very intense summer. But here I am today in Lviv, and although I was not speaking with you, I have kept up perhaps a bit insanely my 10 minutes a day, 7:20 in the morning Chicago time, 3:20 in Ukraine in the afternoon on WGN radio. No matter what I've gone through, what I've been through, somehow I keep going. I just, because I know there's at least some audience in one city in America that will listen to Ukraine every single day. So if people want to follow that, you can look at my YouTube at JP Lindsley, and we post the video versions of those daily radio reports there. And but I think, yeah, I knew we had to speak now with the election in the U.S. just a few weeks away, and it's been something very much on my mind, and so on my mind, and especially given, as you said, the world that I came from, the world that I escaped of Fox News. So I think, and at the outset, I say I would like to get into this if we have the chance, but I think there's one key question that should be asked of Vice President Harris, and one key question that should be asked of Donald Trump before the election. And I'm happy to discuss that.
I know what question I would pose to them. I doubt whether I'll be given that chance. But of course, the big question is how? How is the war going to end? How are their policies going to influence that? Or is it going to drag on in the attritional fashion that we're seeing? And I'm not clear. I mean, I look at a lot of videos, a lot of interviews, a lot of transcripts of interviews. I haven't seen any clear answer or clear solution from either side. It's either warm words of encouragement on the Biden or the Biden-Harris side. You know, we're with you as long as it takes. It's more of that kind of stuff, but with no detail. But on the Trump side, it's I can end this in 48 hours. But no one ever asked the question, how? How are you going to do that? How are you going to persuade Vladimir Putin? How are you going to roll back this genocidal empire when it shows absolutely no sense that it is up for peace or wanting peace of any kind?
Yeah, and I think this is where, and I've seen this having been here, Jonathan, every single day these 2.5 years and before. Uh, the idea of victory. I think back to the horrible spring of 2022, where victory meant surviving for the next hour, especially if you're in a place like Kharkiv, but even here in Lviv, and Kyiv almost fell. And as an American friend who's usually in Kyiv pointed out to me today, in Kyiv was surrounded on three sides by Russians in 2022. Now, if you want to find a Russian, you got to drive something like 10 hours. Like, that's a victory. And I think the media has sucked us into this mentality that that this is as I explained it, it's like we think of Ukraine like a European football game, as a soccer game, where there's lots of activity happening, and at any moment you take a snapshot, you can't make sense of what's happening, and then there's a outcome at the end. But I think we need to look at this more like an American football game, where you can see the progress on the field. You have 4 tries to get first down, and then that's a celebration. The fans celebrate. That's something successful. That's the incursion into Kursk. That's making the Black Sea safer. And I think if we look at it in terms of an American football game, we see that victory is a process of opening up possibilities. But when we only talk about this big grand idea of victory, it sounds impossible. It sounds like someone like an overweight person eating potato chips on a couch saying, I'm going to run the Boston Marathon. Well, you're going to laugh at that. But that person, if they say, okay, I'm going to start eating healthy, next week I'm going to walk a mile, and then within a month I'm going to jog, and then within a few months I'll be going further. And then every time you go further, you see new possibilities. And I think this is how we have to, talk about what victory is. And so on that score, I would say, I mean, I don't know if what's better. I mean, because I know it was such a politically fraught moment here in America. I know it's very tense in America, although it's a different type of tension when you're under missile attack, by the way. And I think actually in Ukraine, what I've observed, people can talk more civilly about the American election, even though it deeply is going to affect what happens here, than they can in America. You can have arguments and debates. There's people here on both sides of the question, and you listen to their arguments. That in America, you can almost not have that conversation. Part of that, I think, is Ukrainian, sort of the free speech of the Ukrainians. But really, another part is after you've been through so many missile attacks and power outages and all that, you get this incredible liberty. You don't care. You will speak your mind, and that strengthens democracy in a way. So I'll leave it to you because I have a question I would love to ask Trump and a question I would love to ask Harris, but I'll leave it to you with whom we should start. And what's the best order?
Clearly, getting the room together is not really an option, but if we get to meet them separately, let's start with the Harris question, because according to many opinion polls, she's still the sort of leader in terms of the popular vote. Of course, there is some concern that actually the Electoral College is swinging more towards Trump's way. So this is on an absolute knife edge. But Harris has been in the White House. She has been closer to some of these decisions that are made regarding Ukraine than any of us have. And from interviews with some people who are close to that campaign, I get a sense that they may be slightly bolder than Biden, but essentially we're looking at a continuation of Sullivan-type caution, even if the figure and person of Sullivan is no longer there in the national security establishment. So, in my view, it's continuity. What is your question then for their team?
Well, and first I'll say I would love it, Jonathan, if you could be the one to interview both of the candidates. But I do have a small dream that we're actually working toward here. Joe Rogan very likely will interview both of these candidates separately, and I'm hoping that some famous Ukrainian sportsmen can reach Joe Rogan. People like Alexander Usyk, Volodymyr Klitschko. Rogan respects him, and I'm hoping that they can reach Rogan and get him to ask questions like this. But when it comes to Vice President Harris, the main thing we know from the Biden administration has forbidden Ukraine from using not just U.S. weapons, but also British weapons. Really, they're doing everything they can to forbid Ukraine from attacking military targets deep within Russia. And this gives Putin free rein to use glide bombs to attack Ukrainian cities, Kharkiv and well beyond. And whenever Ukrainians get a breakthrough, as they did in Kursk, Putin says he's got all of his red lines, and he says if you cross my red lines, I'm going to go nuclear. But probably the biggest red line that's been crossed. Ukrainians entered Russian soil. They're on Russian soil since August. No major response, not at all. And that would be the moment to say, hey, Russia's weaker than they pretend to be. Let's pour on the effort. And Ukrainians keep opening the window of opportunity. But in those moments, the White House, doubles down in its strategy of restricting Ukraine. And so the key question for Kamala Harris is, will you break with the Biden administration? And will you allow long-range strikes on Russian military targets deep within Russia? And there's even two variants there. Because even if you don't want to let U.S. weapons be used, will you at least allow the Brits? Just because there's like, I don't know, it's like 3% of the components of a Storm Shadow. I don't know the actual percentage, but a very small percentage of the components of the British Storm Shadow missiles are made in the U.S. or somehow with U.S. technology, and the U.S. uses that to tell the United Kingdom, no, you can't use that to help Ukraine. So this is the key question for Kamala Harris. Will you break with the Biden administration on this? Because we've seen that every time Ukraine does cross these red lines, Russia gets weaker. So that no one, and Jonathan, no one has asked her that. Not a single. We get interviewers will ask Vice President Harris, what is her favorite flavor of Doritos, which is really interesting because Doritos is owned by Pepsi, which is a company that continues to do business in Russia, a company that flouts. They find the loopholes and they legally flout the Biden-Harris sanctions on Russia. And so we have the face of the sanctions, the vice president, of the Biden administration, talking about her favorite Doritos. What a great moment that would have been to say, you know what? I don't like Doritos anymore because they fuel the Russian war machine. But we don't see any seriousness or any indication that they even care. And so I think that question, but mainly the question of will you allow Ukraine to strike back? No one has asked Vice President Harris. And sometimes I hear, Jonathan, from people who support Harris saying, well, we need strategic ambiguity. She can't answer that question. And if that's the answer, well, then you have to support what Trump is saying, because he gives us plenty of ambiguity, by changing things every few months. So I don't think that's an acceptable answer. But even then, the media needs at least to ask the question, because if you don't, Harris can answer it however she wants, and maybe she'll have a good reason for it, for not answering. But if we don't even ask the question, then it's not a topic. There's no pressure on it to do anything. And it doesn't become part of the agenda of a potential Harris administration.
And I think that it's a very good point. I mean, the deep strike weapons are probably one of the biggest things the US could have done to endorse what Ukraine rather was doing in Russia. Well, we'll come to that in a minute, because I think there's a couple of intentions behind the Kursk incursion that actually talk to both candidates as well. But it's not just the long-range weapons. We hear from many people on the front that actually you have people going out, platoons going out at night, where they only have one night sight amongst 8 soldiers. They have to pass it around. They don't have enough ammunition. They don't have enough this. They don't have enough that. So it's not just the deep strike. We're not even giving them what they need to protect themselves and be effective as military units. Then this is not about a lack of mobilization. This is not about any of the other things you could level as genuine criticisms against Ukraine. These are actual soldiers right now on the front lines who do not have the kit they need, not only to survive, but to beat back the Russians. So they have that capability, and we're actually limiting and denying their ability to exert that capability. Why? Because are we afraid of Russia? Are we afraid of Russia collapsing? Are we afraid of a Russian victory? That would be my question. Are you afraid of Russia being defeated, despite the fact that it's been defeated so many times in history? And without a defeat, Russia does not change. And this is something, Garry Kasparov has made very forcefully this week.
Well, on the question of kit and okay. First, we must mention, there still is a problem with sort of Soviet-minded middle-level commanders in the Ukrainian military. And I hear this all the time when I talk to the guys that are actually doing the fighting as I travel the country. There still is a problem of Soviet-minded, Soviet-trained, fat cat middle commanders that hoard the best stuff, especially vehicles and things like that. That's getting better, but it's still there. It's still a problem. But mainly it's not even the long-range, weapons and permission. It's, the other tools that Ukraine needs. For example, Australia announced today that they're going to send 49 Abrams tanks to Ukraine, more than the United States has sent. And it's back in 2022. All the military experts from America with whom I spoke said, oh, Ukraine can't have Abrams tanks because the highways aren't good enough. And, all these excuses. I'm like, what were Abrams tanks made for? Were they made for the Autobahn? Like, I mean, the Big Sur highway in California, they were made to be in war, and there's just always an excuse and a reluctance. And if you look at, and here's where I understand the frustrations of many Americans, because okay, we had in late September, September 26th, the Biden administration announced $8 billion in aid for Ukraine. And that was the headline. For example, Pentagon announces massive military aid package for Ukraine. Newsweek said Joe Biden's parting gift to Ukraine. And that was the week when the latest spate of major hurricanes was beginning. Incidentally, by the way, there was a great group of Ukrainian soldier musicians I know traveling southeastern United States, dodging these hurricanes and playing for veterans and others in America. But when the headlines are dominated by $8 billion for Ukraine, southeastern United States is getting pummeled, towns destroyed, for example, in my home state of North Carolina. And if you look at people in America who are tired of high prices, they're tired of foreign wars, they don't trust Washington, and they see this 8 billion to Ukraine where they don't even have good evidence that it's working, of course they're going to be frustrated. But what really bothered me with that is that the White House didn't even try to be careful with the optics of that, because that was not a new $8 billion in spending. In fact, every news story I read was not clear about this. Not a single news story was clear about it. I had to do my own research, and I found out that $8 billion was not new. That was what Congress approved. Do you remember in April when we had all the hoopla to get with Mike Johnson and all that to get Congress to approve spending for Ukraine? Well, Joe Biden simply had not got around to releasing all of those funds. And this, he was finally releasing the funds that Congress had authorized. But if your average American busy dealing with the hurricane and all the problems of our lives, they're like, oh, in April, wasn't that already 60 billion? And now I see 8 billion more. So now it's like 70 something. And so the optics were horrible. Like, people can be forgiven for thinking that this is extra money being spent, firstly. And then secondly, of course, it's not even cash. It's a valuation of the equipment that we send very slowly and very reluctantly. And it's, by the way, the president, with the presidential drawdown authority, he could actually lower the valuation of he could value something that's at $30,000 for $1. And so it's almost, when I see things like that coming from the White House, I almost wonder if they really want Ukraine to lose, because they're not even spending any effort on the optics of it, knowing that Americans are frustrated, and rightly so, that they're skeptical when they hear all these big figures. And so when you hear that, and then you see that there's still difficulty getting the right equipment to the guys at the front, it's very disheartening. And I went to this great conference in Kyiv a few weeks ago. It had to be very secret. It was called Brave One, and it was all some of the best defense innovators in Ukraine. A lot of guys who started in their garages in 2022, and now they are making this incredible defense equipment, robots, drones, all extraordinary material. In fact, I saw a robot that can deliver material to the front and that can remove wounded soldiers. Ukrainians can produce, the one I saw is produced for about 50,000 US dollars. The same type of thing with lesser technology is produced and sold in the UK for $450,000. And I think a lot of the defense contractors, instead of being excited about this innovation happening in Ukraine, they don't want anyone to know about it because that's a pretty big difference. And it would show that our defense budgets are bloated and overpriced. And so here's one thing I would say to Americans, that if we can cut through all that, you can actually see that Ukraine is exposing a lot of problems, not only that, we're not ready for this type of warfare in 2024, but also that a lot of the weapons we have can be made better and more cheaply. And I think, there's a lot of people who have a vested interest in that not being known. But if we can, if you're in the White House and you believe in Ukraine, you want Ukraine to win, why would you not take the effort just in a few sentences to describe, hey, we're not sending new money. This is stuff that Congress approved in April. And so I really understand the mood of frustration in America.
And the optics around the 60 billion, the large aid package early in the year, that also seemed to me to be communicated in a very politically weak manner, because when you break that money down, people could be forgiven for thinking, my God, there's going to be piles of cash. It's like another Iraq. There's going to be plane loads of used bills and gold and whatever going over to Ukraine, and goodness knows. First of all, almost no money from that ends up in Ukraine as cash. And actually, a huge, huge chunk of that 60 billion is to replace antiquated or outdated weapon systems that have already been sent. We sent them, I don't say it's junk, but we sent them all the stuff that was on or past its sell-by date. That huge aid package was to replenish what had been used, not necessarily to give Ukraine tons and tons of kit. So good political optics would say, look, this is an investment in the US defense industry. It's an investment in US jobs at an unprecedented scale. Whereas the way it's pitched is people don't really get the sense of that. They just think it's, a pile of money being handed over to Ukraine in a way that lacks transparency.
Yeah, and this is a problem of Washington. I worked in Washington. It's easy to say you're solving a problem by saying, I'm solving poverty, I'm fixing schools by throwing out tons of money. And that's what they do. That's what they excel at. And then people feel good about it somehow until the point when they say, wait, this sounds like too much. And that's, you can disguise your cowardice and having to face tough decisions by saying you're throwing money at the problem. And I even see this in the private sector. Like, I met with some great British volunteers who do a lot for Ukraine, and they were saying it's easy when they raise money to help civilians, but even when they're raising money to help soldiers with mental health, not with weapons, there's people that don't want to support it because they're afraid of helping soldiers. And I think because the war is so far from us in America, I'm always in Ukraine, but from Americans, but also even from Europeans, they don't want to think about the messiness that actually, and there's a Ukrainian columnist who pointed this out very well, that Zelenskyy makes the world uncomfortable because he's a wartime leader. He knows that you have to kill the bad guys to win. And that's the reality. You can have all the recovery conferences you want, but that's not going to do anything. And I see this with what I hear from the Warsaw Security Forum, the Berlin Recovery Conference. They're talking about the Pollyannish pie in the sky, beautiful day in the future when they can they can rebuild and they can profit from here. But no one, very few people want to talk about the messy, horrible work of trying to win. Like I was talking with a friend yesterday or 2 days ago who lost his leg in the battle. That's messy and difficult and sad. And all these fancy people at the conferences in the White House don't want to think about that, of what it's like to be with the rats in the trenches, with the FPV drones targeting you, or what it's like to be a civilian in Kherson targeted by an FPV drone. And I think so. This is really part of the problem. And it's the same disconnect in a way that Washington has with the common people of America. And I think that's why we see so much political frustration on both sides of the aisle in America. They feel disconnected and disrespected. And you see that really powerfully here. I would still, maybe there's someone listening who could help with this, Jonathan, but I would still love to, I just don't have the resources to do this now. I would love to see a study of this because the Pentagon is always buying new weapons, always. And now it seems to me, my thesis is that most of the weapons that they're buying, everything gets pushed into the Ukraine bill. Everything gets blamed on Ukraine. So what would the spending on new weapons be for the Pentagon if there was no Russian war in Ukraine? And can we compare that? Is there some standard to compare and say, because I really do think a lot of the spending that is credited toward Ukraine is money that the Pentagon would be spending anyway in the time of peace, because America is always developing weapons, and no one has studied that. I think that could actually relieve a lot of the financial pressure in the argument for those who support Ukraine.
And we'll come to Israel shortly, because again, Ukraine doesn't seem to be held to the same standard as Israel and the money and weapons that clearly come from the US there. But we'll cover that one in a minute. That's another sort of very tricky area. Well, let's turn to Trump and the question we're going to ask him, because you talk here about a disconnect between Washington and what could be described as the corporate Democrats, and they're being closer to Wall Street than the sort of man in the street, as it were. This disconnect, and of course, almost everybody in Congress is infinitely richer than almost anybody else you might meet on the on the underground or the metro. So there is this disparity in lifestyles, wealth, and so on. And that's not just on the Republican side; that's on the Democrat side as well. Clearly, and we've seen stories about that before. But then you have someone like Trump, who seems to be able to connect with people who are really feeling these issues, financial issues, issues of legacy industries and towns getting poorer and declining, and all the other sort of social issues that are driving what could be described as a sort of protest MAGA vote. But from my perspective here, Trump seems to me the very embodiment of an oligarch, the very embodiment of someone who is utterly disconnected from the way an average person lives. And he has said extraordinarily ambiguous things at times about Ukraine. He's also said some extremely plain things which do not bode well. He said things that suggest that he could, if it's in his self-interest, quite happily throw Ukraine under the bus. But again, as with the Democrat camp, we don't know exactly what he will do or not do. We don't really have any clarity on the policy or the solution to the problem. So what's your question to him?
Well, first, I think a lot of what, from my experience in media in New York and politics in Washington, I think a lot of what Trump says out loud is what politicians who hate him would say after a few drinks, so even on Ukraine. They're I think that's pretty clear. So Trump, in the way, gives, that's why he resonates with people, because they think they're getting this real scoop after they're tired of what the usual BS. And I think that Trump, my question is based on a simple thing, not on how he not how does he plan to negotiate with Putin and all that, because I think it's something more basic with Trump. So with Harris and Biden, it's okay. You say you believe in this cause; it's a just cause, and you want Ukraine to win. Why will you not let it happen? With Trump, it's more foundational. And so Trump has said many times recently, and over the summer, he began to surround himself more and more with people who are against Ukraine. Back in June, about 50% of the people, as far as I could tell, I know some people in that world from my old Fox days, 50% of the people close to Trump were sort of in favor of Ukraine. A lot of them without moral courage, because they were quiet about it. But if they could get enough support, they would push for it, because they saw it was right. And 50% of the people against Ukraine. My assessment now is that it's about 85% of the people who could work for Trump are against Ukraine, and 15% for. So we lost a lot of ground there. And that's why I think it's very important to pay attention to who works for the president, and the people that whisper into the ears of the powerful. And so Trump has said many times in the past months, including, for example, Jonathan, a month ago, these Ukrainian soldier musicians who I mentioned, some of them are wounded. One of them is an opera singer who lost his leg. They're traveling to the U.S. They actually were playing in my parents' house in North Carolina. 3 miles away, Trump was having a rally in Mint Hill outside of Charlotte, North Carolina. And while you have these brave, it was so sad, because you have these brave Ukrainian warriors who would, if they were on the stage, they would have inspired that crowd, because they come from the same sense of values. But instead, you had Trump on the stage 3 miles away saying, and he said something very close to this. He said, all Ukrainian cities are lost. They're all destroyed. And so the question I would ask Trump is, well, you said all Ukrainian cities are destroyed. Well, actually, yes, some are. The smaller cities in the east are destroyed. And this happens at a very slow rate, but we look at Bakhmut, we look at Volodar, Volchansk, there are cities that are destroyed. But the major cities, Kyiv, Lviv, Odessa, even Kharkiv, 30 miles from Russia, they're not destroyed. They're bruised, but they're far from destroyed. And this is only because the people in those cities, they would rather live under the threat of missile attack than give up their freedom, which is something that you say you believe in so much. So at a basic level, forget about what you want to do with Ukraine. Why do you refuse even to respect and acknowledge the Ukrainian people who stand for freedom? Why do you refuse to even acknowledge the fact that, everyone thought Kyiv was going to fall, or that Kharkiv was going to fall even as recently as May, and those cities still stand They have less crime than American cities. They're cleaner than American cities, and they're safer as long the moments when there's no Russian attack. These cities are safer. Why do you castigate these free cities? Why do you base your arguments on this false information about Ukrainian cities? And I think that's the first thing to ask Trump, and the most important thing.
That's exceptionally important, isn't it? And I think we mentioned Kursk, and we were talking about Kursk before we hit record. I think both Russia, unfortunately, but also Ukraine have come to understand these games of Washington politics far more, and they're basing their decisions on it. We'll come to Russia in a minute because that's kind of disturbing how much I think they understand Western weakness and the weakness of Washington and Berlin. But let's start with the message that Zelenskyy and his commanders, I think, sent to Biden and their team. There were multiple reasons, I think, for the Kursk incursion: in increasing morale, forcing Russia to mobilize more troops. We're seeing that play out right now. We're seeing an increased Russian budget, recognizing that it not only has to take Ukrainian territory, but it has to try to take back its own territory. But there's another really important thing, I think, about this, which was to the Biden administration. It was saying, here is the ultimate red line, the one that was supposed to trigger World War III, nuclear response, apocalypse. Instead of that, President Putin has been pretending it's not an issue, pretending it doesn't even exist, hiding the scale of the challenge from his own people. It has highlighted the extraordinary fragility, I think, of Putin's regime, and it's shown that those red lines are illusory. I suspect that Zelenskyy thought that this would put a bit of backbone into Western strategy, a bit of backbone into the Biden administration, but it hasn't done that at all. Rather, it has shown up the weakness clearer than it's ever been.
Jonathan, you put that perfectly. And I think, this is the same, when the Russians attacked the children's hospital in Kiev, the Akhmedid hospital, on July 8th, it was the eve of the NATO summit. And there was a lot of hope in Ukraine that would persuade people in NATO to wake up and say, we got to do something. But I never had that hope. And by the end of the week, my pessimism on that score was confirmed, because anyone who's going to care about cities being destroyed, erased, would already have cared from Mariupol. So if a new destruction is not going to make you care more. In fact, everyone has now moved on. In fact, even the United Nations Secretary General says that Gaza is the worst tragedy of our times, ignoring the fact, we don't even have to get in a game of comparing, but like totally ignoring the fact that if you add up all the Ukrainian cities that have been deleted in the east, again, Kyiv and Kharkiv are strong, but the small, tiny cities that Russia has destroyed, it's about the size of Gaza, and Ukraine's not even part of that conversation. And so anyone who wasn't already moved by saying, "Hey, this is horrible, we have to stop it," is not going to be moved by new incidents. And by the same token, anyone who was not impressed by Ukrainian resistance and said, but by Ukrainian resistance against Russian red lines, I don't see why would they change? What all of a sudden, after one more amazing Ukraine defeat of a Russian red line, they're going to wake up? No, they clearly they're on a different pattern of thinking. They don't the Black Sea victories. I mean, the Black Sea. I was swimming in the Black Sea a month ago. That was inconceivable in 2022, 2023. And Odessa, the Russians still pound the port of Odessa. With ballistic missiles and Iranian drones, but the sea does not have Russian ships, and so there's a victory. We have all these victories. We have every day in Kharkiv city, that city comes more and more back to life. More people go back there, even amid the threats. That's the victory, and we go back to in May when the United States did give this very reluctant permission for Ukraine to, within a 100-kilometer band, to hit Russian targets that were attacking Kharkiv. And that, I remember Jake Sullivan had said in 2022, he said, if we give ATACMS to Ukraine, we're going to get to World War III. That was July 2022. Well, ATACMS are here. There's no World War III. Every time that Ukraine gets more power, they use it well, and Russia gets weaker. But clearly, this is not even This doesn't enter in the minds at all into the Biden administration, and so it's got to be something else to change it. And I think that's why I think one of the best things that can change this is a strategy I've been working on, which I guess I shouldn't be shy about because we got to push it. Like the only thing I can see to turn this around, we need the popular media voices that influence American mood and American culture, that ultimately influence our politics. Because right now there's no pressure for either Biden or for either Harris or Trump to really do something big about Ukraine. There's not really pressure. I mean, during the vice presidential debate between J.D. Vance and Tim Walz, not a single question about Ukraine because it's not even in the stream of the thinking in the media. And so that's why I really am pushing to get a few Ukrainian sportsmen, whether it's Oksana Usyk or Volodymyr Klitschko, to challenge Joe Rogan, go right to the top. Joe Rogan's got a bigger audience than CBS, ABC, Fox, and to go to Joe Rogan and say, hey, you know, how about you listen to a few voices from Ukraine after 2.5 years? At the very least, there's inspiring stories here. It's not boring, you know? And I've seen that with my daily audience in Chicago, WGN radio, every single day, Monday through Friday, 10 minutes, 2.5. I can't believe it, Jonathan, 2.5 years. And so, you know, sometimes I'm like, oh man, I'm not sure I'm ready to do it. But every day I do it. And every day the audience is there because it's not boring at the very least, you know, so at least we can get people to listen. But if we can start to say, look, what you believe about Ukraine is not true in two ways. One, Putin's red lines. Ukraine has proved at least 18, 19 quantifiable clear times now that that's all, as Biden would say, malarkey. It's a mirage. It's bluffing. And two, all the resources that America has claimed or the West has claimed to spend on Ukraine is much less than it seems. And if we could say these 2 points, I think it can begin to get Americans to say, hey, okay, wait a second. Maybe I've been wrong. You know, if I've been skeptical of Ukraine, my skepticism really is of Washington, not of Ukraine. I'm skeptical, you know, and that skepticism should be rightly directed toward Washington, but not to Ukraine, not to Zelenskyy, not to the people of Ukraine. And B, to say, oh wait, we've missed this, but actually Ukraine is showing that it's possible. As I like to say, a well-armed freedom can stop tyranny. Like, you know, it's when people do extraordinary things and they survive and they smile about it, you don't realize all the effort that goes into it. So the fact that, you know, the coffee shops are pouring lattes in Kharkiv 15 minutes or Odessa 15 minutes after a missile strike, you know, because they're not crying about it. You know, maybe people don't realize like the extraordinary nature of these people and what they're resisting against. And I think, yeah, and I think we've lost, Jonathan, a lot of the memories of, you know, what it would be like to live under totalitarianism. And this is the very thing the Americans are worried about. We talk about it in terms of AI. You know, we're going to be, you know, controlled by AI. We talk about it in terms of, you know, we feel controlled by the media, manipulated by Washington and all this stuff. And all those are legitimate concerns, but this is the edge of it. This is the extreme of it. This is because in Moscow, in Russia, there is no freedom of speech. It doesn't exist, and anywhere under its control, there is no ability to be free. And the Ukrainians are the only people in the world right now willing to fight and die for that principle. And the last thing on this, I look at Elon Musk, and you know, who's brilliant. I mean, he had brilliant achievements. You know, catching the rocket launcher. All credit to that. That's incredible. And yet, so myopic when it comes to this situation in Ukraine. And the people in the world of Trump, RFK Jr., Elon Musk, and others, like they will say, for example, that we stand with the people of Ireland against the immigrant invasion. And they'll share videos of immigrants, you know, beating people up in the street in Ireland. Okay, whatever you think of that. But why would they not care about the worst type of illegal immigrants, namely Russians armed with ballistic missiles and tanks, destroying cities, raping women as they occupy a place or as they leave the occupation. This is there's this a major disconnect that and this is one thing. I mean, I struggle to, when I talk to people in America, to get them to see that this is everything they're complaining about at this micro level. This is the worst part of it. And maybe, Jonathan, it's that maybe this is a big problem with Washington on all sides, and that the most difficult, tricky problems, the messiest problems, they don't want to look at it. They don't want to think about it. I mean, and you know what? It's not fun. It's not nice. And this is what Zelenskyy, that's why he's become the statesman that he is. You know, because he could have easily have left this and he would still be a hero. He could be living in exile and he would be well treated. He faces it. The people of Ukraine face it every day. And it's you know, and I think the rest of us, even people nearby in other places in Europe, they want to pretend that things are not as bad as they are. And it's a shame because right now they have a bodyguard willing to keep the threat away. All they have to do, and we're getting closer to saying I hate to say it, all they had to do was to give the tools and even just the permission, and they won't do it.
And this is it. If you've ever seen the film Train Spotting, you know, you've got Ukraine, the bouncer outside the nightclub, and it's keeping out, you know, the drunken crowd led by the Begbie of nations, which of course is Russia, is the sort of psychotic guy with the broken end of a glass bottle who wants to thrust it into your face. That is Russia, unfortunately. And I mean, for me, it was the experience of actually going and living in Russia for up to 3 years in the 90s. When you're there immersed in a free society, you see all its problems, of course you do, but it's like being in a warm bath because you know nothing else. You can't tell the temperature outside. But if you see a society that is either trying to recover from authoritarianism or, as in the case of Russia, you know, started to slide back into it, you see what that differential is. You see what that contrast is, and you see why it's worth fighting for. As dysfunctional as our countries are, as dysfunctional and filled with problems as they are, at least if you're someone with imagination and strength, you can go out and you can try to implement solutions to some of those problems. No one's going to take you into a courtyard and shoot you for trying to do that or for having original ideas. And I think this is unfortunately, people are very far from that lived experience. Let's turn to Kursk again, because you've got that strong message that was sent to the Biden administration, trying to wake them up, to put a bit of spine into them, and it didn't work. But there's another message with Kursk. And this is where I think Zelenskyy and his commanders are incredibly clever. They know that not only is the election coming up in the US, and that there is a good chance that Trump might win that. The chance is not zero. The chance at the moment is riding about sort of 50-50. They're also fully aware that Western allies, including European allies, are getting progressively weaker and more timid and less up for the difficult tasks of fighting and, you know, encouraging their populations to support it. There are some exceptions. You know, the Nordics, the Baltics are strong. Poland is pretty strong most of the time, though it does descend into its own little sort of navel-gazing partisan sort of political struggles with some frequency, which distracts it from the big picture. But they are investing massively in their military, so it's an uneven picture. But if you look at the heartlands of Europe, Germany, France, you can tell they're going soft again. Brussels is going soft on the idea of Ukrainian victory. It is getting ready to surrender. So by grabbing a chunk of Russian territory, you make it actually rather difficult for an unjust, quick and dirty peace to be thrust upon Ukraine, because you can't just negotiate a big chunk of Ukrainian territory away just like that, because they've got a chunk of Russia hostage. They've got it by the short and curly, as they say. You know, they've got Russia by the balls here. And that's fortunate because Trump might get in, and this really complicates his idea that he could simply end the war in 48 hours. It's not going to be quick. It's not going to be simple. And this is an incredibly clever strategy, I think, on part of Ukraine. What do you make of this?
Well, I think yeah, it was absolutely a brilliant strategy. But the unfortunate thing is now, I mean, that was in August when Ukrainians made that advance, and they've held that territory until recently. Now we have reports that the Russians are pushing back, and Ukraine is starting to lose that. And here's what we see time and time again: the window of opportunity the Ukrainians had pried open is closing. It was like the winter a year ago, the winter of 2023 to 2024. All the headlines warned that it was going to be the worst winter ever. Constant, strikes on Ukraine's infrastructure. I think we had no power outages pretty much all winter. It was a good winter, and that's because Ukraine had diverted Russia's attention. Russia was forced to move its Black Sea fleet from Crimea to Novorossiysk on the Russian mainland. Russia was distracted; they could not fight back. It was a huge window of opportunity, and that's when the funding dried up from Washington. And so we see that now. Kursk was an amazing thing, and it certainly boosts morale here. So there are benefits that are lasting, but the opportunity is being wasted, and the window is closing, and the Russians are moving in. And I think, and what we see, it was a very difficult weekend. I think psychologically, the last weekend here in Ukraine, because the Veskomat, the military recruitment officers, which really is a vestige of Soviet times, they had their biggest, most public raids that they have had in these 2.5 years. And firstly, it's amazing that a nation at war could last 2.5 years without having to get to this point. But they raided the most popular elite posh places in Kyiv. For example, they even went to hotels in Lviv. I know Americans who experienced this, and they were knocking on the doors of every hotel room. There was a hotel clerk at a hotel where Americans were staying, and she was calling everyone saying, "Don't answer the door. What they're doing is illegal." And this was the first moment in Ukraine where I saw this breakdown of in the center of cities of the democratic civil society. And the Ukrainians in 2014, when they had that revolution of dignity, one of the things they got rid of, which Americans have no idea about, is a secret police force. They still had like a Soviet apparatus over them, and they got rid of it. But now, from last weekend, I felt for the first time it's coming back. And here's why: is because this war is a test of whether free people can actually be free. Can they actually withstand elite tyranny? And it's a message that should resonate with people all over the world who are frustrated with the governments, who feel that they don't have a voice in politics, that the oligarchs control things, because we have that to different degrees around the world. But this is the extreme test of it. And after 2.5 years, the people get tired. And the Russians know it. This is what they're banking on. They can keep breaking the spirits. They break the spirits in Washington and London and other places. Certainly Berlin, it was a bit easier to do that. And they try to do it here. And they just know if they can keep that up, they'll get to a point where Ukraine will have to give up a lot. And so anyone who believes in freedom, this should be the rallying point. But I think if you see, people don't want to give up comfort easily. And so even, for example, look at all the sanctions. Look at the Czech Republic. They've been very good supporter of Ukraine, especially with ammunition. The president of Czechia, former NATO general. But Czech Republic, they've given their valuation of support to Ukraine is about 1.3 billion since 2022. During that same time, the Czech Republic has sent more than $7 billion to Russia for fossil fuels. They've been buying Russian oil and gas. $7 billion. So they give 1.3 billion in aid to Ukraine. It's like the company that makes Oreos, Mondelez, based in Chicago. In 2022, they're like, "Oh, we'll give Ukraine," I forget, it was like a couple $100,000 or $1 million, whatever. They've made like they've made hundreds of millions of dollars in profit in Russia. And so you have like the cosmetic thing, we give the donation, but everything else we do is actually undermining the victory effort. So even if a nation like Czech Republic, which remembers the history of communism and Moscow tyranny and suffered under it, and says that they're helping and they're doing a lot to help, even they don't want to deal with higher oil prices. They don't want to deal with that discomfort. And so they're still happy to fund the Russian war machine. And I think, so if people in Czech Republic are doing that, then no wonder America is even more
This
checked
is
out.
it. This is one of the problems. And when you have relatively weak, managerially minded leaders with precarious majorities, of course, they don't want to put that at risk. Well, the last area I want to turn to is actually that Russia actually understands these things. It doesn't understand how democracy works. It probably doesn't even believe that democracy is a real thing, but it does understand that in our systems, there's a certain amount of fragility here. And that is open to external pressure that can influence and change the outcome of elections. They will have seen processes like Brexit. Whether or not they actually moved the dial on that, they almost certainly believe that they did. And I think that's the important thing here. And there are many other electoral processes where I think they will feel they've actually had some kind of influence or sway there. And this is my worry. We're very close now to the US election. They will have seen how the hurricane has had an extraordinary influence, actually. It's nudged the dial of the vote, where Harris seemed to have some momentum, was gaining ground, and the lead was growing, and that is now shrinking again. And part of that are the optics around the hurricane, as well as other factors, which I think the pollsters are struggling to really understand the mechanics of what's going on there. But Russia must be looking at this thinking, if this is on a knife edge, it's something we can influence. And if we assume, because I think the signal's fairly clear on this, if we assume that Russia would prefer a Trump win over a Harris win, I think there's little doubt that they do. I know some people will argue the toss on that one, but if you listen to propagandists and you read a lot of stuff about it, I think they're pretty clear that Trump, with all his uncertainty and so on, they see that as a win. In fact, Putin's strategy is very much counting on the Trump win. They may feel that they can influence the outcome. Um, and there are several ways they can do it. They could provoke more provocations in the Middle East, more chaos and violence there, which sucks up the oxygen. They could even prompt some kind of provocation on the territory of the US itself. Or the rumors that are going around at the moment is they're planning massive missile strikes on Ukraine in the coming weeks prior to the election to make Biden and his entire administration look weak and pathetic and like losers. That is what some of the conversations are centering on.
Well, I think one of the coups of Russian propaganda is convincing Americans going back to 2016 that they can change our elections. I think that, Russia. It's about Potemkin, smoke and mirrors, and propaganda. Is never really clear. It succeeds when it confuses us, and when it makes us sort of scream and yell at each other. And propaganda, you make the the weak entity become, make it look like it's something to be afraid of. And we see this with the nuclear threats. Even, for example, that new Bob Woodward book, the headlines and the stories said, oh, according to Woodward's reporting, Russia, this American officials were afraid of Russia's nuclear threat. And the way it was framed was that, that there was a clear and present nuclear threat from Russia in 2022. But if you step back and you look at how propaganda works, Russia was building the fear. That's all they were doing for years. They were trying to get, to instill and train people to be afraid. And so the propaganda works not in a simple. I mean, I think Russia, they can't control the U.S. election. It's too, we Americans can't even control it in a way. It's 50 states, and I think Russians are smartly preparing for both scenarios. If what do they do if Harris wins? What do they do if Trump wins? And that's the way we should be thinking. But I think so many of us, we get, we're sucked up into the optics and like, oh, this or that, whatever, Trump would be worse or Harris would be worse, whatever. What we should be doing instead is saying, what do we do no matter who wins? Because that's the best, the thing we can hope to influence. And I think, look at with the hurricanes, the Russians didn't have to do much to inflame opposition to Ukraine with the hurricanes. The White House did it for them by announcing at that very time, we're going to give $8 billion to Ukraine. It was horrible because you could just know that people suffering, people suffering are going to say, what the hell? But B, Russian propaganda, all they had to do was press repost, and spread it. And, it worked perfectly. They barely had to lift a finger. The White House gave them that opportunity. And so I think here's where, if we really are serious about fighting this, we have to be smart about it. We have to realize the optics. What are the storylines it's going to be easy to run with? And I think the biggest thing with propaganda is where you get sucked into it. Like, propaganda seeks to set the agenda. We have to say, wait, okay, no matter what happens, what is the truth as we see it? What are the questions we need to ask? And let's not be manipulated by it. Like, what was the cover of the New Yorker right now? Do you know?
Oh, I've seen that. It's horrific. Yeah. Is that Mr. Navalny? Yes.
Like, the
It's a
guy,
kind of Che
okay,
Guevara type,
Academy Award already. He died over, almost a year ago. Russia told us he died in February, and Russia is very good. As I say, they are the school shooter of nations. They're extremely good at playing the victim, and they get everyone to care about one dead Russian, and not the Ukrainians who resist every single day. And so, even in the media that's far from the world of Trump, like the New Yorker, they still play into this without, I think, realizing it. And so I think this is where we have to be super sharp about the propaganda. And I think, one of the most basic things, and Jonathan, this is a big frustration I have, is, my former colleagues and even friends in America who are supporting Israel against Tehran, against Hamas, and they say nothing about Ukraine. A lot of these people came to Ukraine in 2022 when it was trending and easy. And they said, oh, we support Ukraine. Totally silent now. Absolute cowardice. And pretty soon I have to start saying their names publicly because they're very influential people. But so on the West, we're completely divided. But then we see that Iran, Hamas, North Korea, there's North Korean troops already here and more preparing to come to Ukraine. Iranian drones, for about 2 months until a few nights ago, 2 months, almost every single night, Iranian drones are hitting Ukrainian cities. You add that up, it's more than what's happening to Israel. But you see that those powers are aligned together. And that doesn't mean that the cause of Ukraine is the same as the cause of Israel. I'm not even getting into that. But it means that we should at least be smart and say, wait a second, the people who are opposing Israel are the same people, they're allied together with the people opposing Ukraine. And if we don't even recognize that, I don't know how we get out of this. And so I think
North Korea, I'm going to jump in there and mention North Korea because go back a few years, go back a couple of decades, in fact, and North Korea was seen as a significant threat to world peace. And I remember all the column inches about that. Now we have up to half of Russia's artillery rounds that it requires at least 3 million a year, I think was the figure I saw. Half of that artillery is being provided by North Korea. And now it's reported that North Korean troops will be fighting alongside. I'm putting out a video on this this week, which essentially is going to say North Korea has invaded Europe. You look at the numbers there, and that is actually what is happening. Go back 2 decades, people would have lost their minds over it. There's barely a mention. In fact, today, with that story breaking, actually, the story that a lot of media ran with is that North Korea has blown up quite a few roads along the sort of contact line with South Korea, which, of course, that in itself is a major event. But the idea that 10,000 Korean troops are essentially fighting on European territory, supported by millions of artillery shells, supported by Iranian munitions in this alliance of autocracies, people would have lost their minds a few decades ago. And now it barely bats an eyelid.
Yeah, and you think about, we think, Russia says if NATO troops are on Ukrainian soil, that's another red line. But North Korean troops in Ukrainian soil, and the West does not draw a red line. But even what more powerfully here is that Ukraine does not need and does not want and does not ask for NATO troops, because Ukraine, a smaller country, doesn't need that. All they need is permission. Okay, they need more tools. They need more air defense. One reason why they need more air defense is because they don't have permission to stop this right now, and that's why it takes more. You're gonna need perpetual air defense. But a much smaller nation, Ukraine, this is a sign of Ukraine's success, because Russia, the vast nation of Holy Mother Russia has now to go to like the trailer park of nations, with all respect, no respect, North Korea, and that's a sign of what Ukraine can achieve. And if you just, and we don't, the West does not need to escalate the way Russia has. The West does not need to put Western troops there. And again, Ukraine doesn't want it. All the West has to do is to untie Ukraine's hands. And because what, after North Korea, who's Russia going to turn to for soldiers? And so I think this is an, I don't know, but again, what does it take to get people to wake up? And I think this is the I admit I struggle with this question in my daily reporting and conversations with Americans. Like, it's so plain. Iranians, how they're working against Ukraine, against free people, against pluralistic Israel, and I think this is the biggest question in the presidential election, and yet it's the one that's the least discussed. And I mean, when Trump was president, he was meeting with Kim Jong in on North Korean soil. I think there has to be some kind of credit for that. Like there was a time of less tension, but I think also in those times of less tension, that's the times when people should be preparing, and that's where we get to complacency. And now, so in that sense, nothing that happened before matters. All that matters now is like who is able to find the conviction to lead people, as you say, not to be managerial, not to be bureaucrats, but to be leaders. And I think this is where Zelenskyy can offer, but not just Zelenskyy, but the entire nation of Ukraine. That's why Ukraine is a nation of Churchills. It's a nation of people who, and I say this, like, I was meeting with these British people that have this psychological support group for Ukrainians. They're investing a lot of money here to help people come together in groups with top psychiatrists to work through the trauma. And I was explaining to them, like, when further west I am in Ukraine, it's easier to get depressed. Like in Lviv, it's easy to be depressed because the future seems limited, but you have no adrenaline. You're not under attack all the time. Go to Kharkiv, and your depression goes away because you're always under some kind of threat. There's adrenaline, but more than that, you're surrounded by people who, and that word for victory in Ukrainian, paramoha, means over your might, over your ability. People doing the most extraordinary things every day. Whereas in Russian, it's pro beta, after the misery, after the shit. Two different mentalities. And you see that most extremely in Kharkiv. And the more that people can see that and say, hey, wait a second. Not only does this inspire me to get out of bed in Chicago or in New York or Los Angeles, this shows me that we can actually win. And I think it's those stories that have to be shared. I think that's the only way to turn this around, to really show the stories of, and to hear the voices of the people that actually meet this threat directly, not the politicians, but the people that actually meet it. And Jonathan, I think if we can do that, we can begin to turn things around. Whoever will be president next year.
I think you're right there. After 2 and a bit years of immersing myself in propaganda, I think I've realized that telling better stories is the only way to counter it. As you say, rather than get sucked into the sort of partisan sort of conflict of narratives, which is what it wants. I hope that you and I get the chance to put these questions to the candidates. I hope that we get to fulfill your plan, which is to get these strong personalities in front of Joe Rogan. So if anyone is listening who can make that happen, if anyone who sees a story and an opportunity in this pitch, do give me and Joe a call. I think it's of paramount importance. For today, though, Joe, thank you so much for everything you do. Thank you for spending so much time in sharing those experiences with the audience at this critical time. And yeah, let's make sure we chat again, not in a couple of months' time, but regularly. And we'll have another chat, probably this time either just before the election or just after the election. Let's see.
Let's do it. I stand by here, Jonathan. I always appreciate these moments to assess things, and I feel smarter afterward. And I welcome anyone to follow our work at UkrainianFreedomNews.com. You can also follow me on YouTube at JP Lindsley. My daily reports every single day, Chicago's WGN Radio, with host Bob Surratt, live from Ukraine. Jonathan, always great to talk to you. We'll keep navigating this stuff as Ukrainians say, malu po malu, step by step.